far from America's crowded cities, far from the places where life rarely slows down, and far from the glow of millions of lights that illuminate the modern world each night, there is a place where distance still shapes everyday life. A place where winter can linger for months, where temperatures can fall far below zero, and where entire communities exist hundreds of miles from the nearest city. In much of modern America, people are rarely far from something. A town, a highway, a store, a signal. But here, the spaces between places feel different. Larger, quieter, older. The roads stretch for long distances through forests that seem endless. Rivers flow across landscapes few people will ever see. And beyond the last signs of urban life, the wilderness begins to reclaim the horizon. For many Americans, this region exists mostly as an idea. A distant frontier, a place glimpsed from airplane windows, or imagined through stories of snow and wilderness. But for those who live here, it is not a frontier. It is home. A place where seasons still dictate the rhythm of life, where isolation is not unusual, and where silence remains part of the landscape itself. This is Alaska's interior. One of the largest inhabited regions in North America. Yet fewer than 100,000 people live across much of the interior. An area larger than many countries, with fewer people than a single mid-sized American city, and one of the most sparsely populated places in the United States. A land of vast forests, long rivers, endless winters, and communities scattered across extraordinary distances. In a country that continues to grow, build, and move ever faster, the interior remains something increasingly rare. A place where space still feels limitless, and where the modern world seems just a little farther away. But perhaps the most fascinating question is not why this place remains so remote. The real question is, why do people continue to stay here? To understand Alaska's interior, it helps to forget the way most people experience distance. In much of America, towns are connected by highways, Cities are separated by only a few hours of driving, and signs of human life are never very far away. But the interior follows a different scale. A scale measured not by neighborhoods or city blocks, but by forests, rivers, and vast stretches of wilderness. The region covers an enormous portion of Alaska. Yet only a small number of people live here. Entire communities are separated by hundreds of miles. Some are connected by a single road. Others by river. And some can only be reached by small aircraft. In parts of the interior, flying is not a luxury. It is the only practical connection to the outside world. As the landscape unfolds, the distances begin to feel almost endless. The roads run through forests that seem to have no edge. Mountain ranges rise beyond the horizon, and between one settlement and the next, there is often far more wilderness than civilization. Much of the interior is covered by boreal forest, one of the largest forest ecosystems on Earth. Millions of trees stretching across a landscape so vast that some areas appear almost untouched by time. In winter, these forests disappear beneath snow and silence. In summer, they become a sea of green, extending far beyond sight. Threading through this wilderness are the rivers. Long before highways crossed the region, the rivers connected people to one another. They carried supplies, news, families, and entire communities. Even today, many of them remain essential to life in the interior. Because here, distance is never just geography. It shapes how people travel, how they work, how they communicate, and sometimes how they survive. In much of the modern world, distance has become something people barely notice. A number on a screen, a route calculated in seconds. But in Alaska's interior, distance still feels real. It can be seen in the empty spaces between communities, in the long stretches of forest, in the rivers that disappear beyond the horizon, and in the overwhelming sense that the world around you is far larger than the human presence within it. more than anything else. Life in Alaska's interior is shaped by winter. Not simply because it is cold, but because winter stays. Long after it has disappeared elsewhere. As autumn fades, the landscape begins to change. The rivers slow. The forests grow quiet. And the first snow settles across the ground. Then gradually, the temperatures continue to fall. Far below freezing in some parts of the interior. Temperatures can drop below -40 degrees. At those temperatures, the air itself feels different. Every movement becomes more deliberate. Every journey requires preparation, and everyday tasks demand a little more patience. Yet what surprises many visitors is not the cold. It is the darkness. As winter deepens, the days grow shorter. The sun rises late and disappears again only a few hours later. For much of the day, the landscape exists beneath a dim blue light. A brief pause between one darkness and the next. The forests become shadows. The rivers become silent pathways of ice. And entire communities settle into the rhythm of a season that seems to slow the world itself. Too many outsiders. Such conditions sound difficult to imagine. But for the people who live here, winter is not an interruption. It is simply part of the year. Homes are built for it. Vehicles are prepared for it. Daily routines adapt to it. Life continues. Children still go to school. People still travel. Communities still gather. The season changes many things, but it does not stop life. Perhaps that is what makes the interior different. People here do not try to conquer winter. They learn how to live alongside it. And eventually, after months of snow, months of cold, and months of darkness, something begins to change. The sunlight lingers a little longer each day. The shadows retreat. The rivers slowly awaken beneath the ice, and the long winter begins to loosen its grip. Because winter is only half the story. The other half arrives with surprising speed. Summer, a season that transforms the interior almost completely. The snow disappears. The forests return to life. And the daylight seems endless. In some places, the sun barely leaves the sky. The long darkness of winter is replaced by weeks of extraordinary light. Days stretch late into the night, and time itself begins to feel different once again. For those who have never experienced it, the contrast can seem almost impossible. One season defined by darkness, another by light. One by silence and stillness, the other by movement and growth. Yet, together, they form the rhythm of life in Alaska's interior. A rhythm shaped not by schedules or city streets, but by the changing relationship between people and the land around them. Long before roads crossed Alaska's interior, the rivers were already there, flowing through forests, valleys, and vast stretches of wilderness, connecting places that would otherwise have remained isolated from one another. Among them, none was more important than the Yukon River, stretching for thousands of miles across the north. The Yukon became one of the great waterways of North America. For generations, it served as a route for travel, trade, communication, and survival. Long before modern transportation reached the interior, the river connected communities scattered across enormous distances. People traveled its waters by canoe, by boat, and later by steamboat, carrying supplies into places where roads did not exist, and bringing news from settlements hundreds of miles away. Further south, the Tanana River played a similar role, winding across the interior. It became another vital pathway through a landscape where movement was often difficult. Together, these rivers helped shape the human geography of Alaska's interior. Villages emerged along their banks, trading routes followed their currents, and entire communities learned to organize life around the seasons of the river. In summer, the waterways opened paths across the wilderness. In winter, many of them transformed into frozen corridors stretching across the landscape. The river changed, but it never stopped being important. Even today, many communities remain closely connected to these waterways, not because the modern world failed to arrive, but because the rivers continue to offer something the landscape has always demanded: connection. In much of the modern world, roads determine where people live. where businesses grow, and where communities form. But in Alaska's interior, many of those patterns began with rivers. The waterways came first. The settlements followed. And, in many ways, they still define the rhythm of life today. Because here, the rivers are more than features on a map. They are part of the story of how people learned to live within a land of extraordinary distance, a land where movement was never easy, and where, for generations, water became the thread that connected one isolated community to another. For many people, Alaska's interior appears empty, a landscape of forests, rivers, snow, and distance. But scattered throughout that vast wilderness are communities that have called this place home for generations. Small villages, remote settlements, towns separated by forests, mountains, and rivers. Places where everyone seems to know one another.
I said, "You call that a shortcut?" Took us till midnight to find the trail again.
And where the pace of life is often shaped more by the seasons than by the clock. Life here is different from life in America's larger cities. Not necessarily easier, and certainly not always convenient, but different. The distances are greater. The winters are longer. And the connection between people and place remains unusually strong. In many communities, daily life still revolves around relationships. Neighbors helping neighbors. Families remaining close across generations. People relying on one another when conditions become difficult. The modern world exists here. There are schools, shops, vehicles, internet connections. Yet even with those changes, the interior continues to feel distinct, because the landscape is never far away. The forests remain. The rivers remain. The long winters remain. And life continues to adapt around them. For some families, their roots in the interior stretch back generations. For others, the journey here came later. Drawn by work. Opportunity, or simply the desire to live somewhere different. But regardless of how they arrived, many people eventually discover the same thing. The interior is not merely a place where they live. It becomes a place that shapes how they see the world. A place where distance encourages patience, where seasons demand preparation, and where silence is not something unusual, but something woven into everyday life. Perhaps that is why so many communities endure here. Not because life is easy, and not because the challenges have disappeared, but because over time, people learn to belong to the landscape around them, rather than expecting the landscape to belong to them. Looking at Alaska's interior from the outside, it is easy to focus on the challenges. The long winters, the vast distances, the isolation, and the countless reminders that life here is rarely convenient. Which raises a simple question: why stay? Why continue living in a place so far from the centers of modern America? For some, the answer begins with family. Their parents lived here. Their grandparents lived here. And the stories of their lives are woven into the rivers, the forests, and the communities they helped build. Leaving would mean leaving behind more than a house. It would mean leaving behind a part of who they are. For others, the interior provides work. In transportation, education, public service, research, and the quiet industries that keep this region alive. But practical reasons alone do not explain everything. Because many people who arrive here eventually discover something unexpected, a connection to the place itself. A connection that can be difficult to describe. Part of that connection is practical. The landscape is not simply something people look at. It is something many families still live with every day. Across parts of the interior, people continue to fish the rivers during the summer months. Salmon, whitefish, and other species that have sustained communities for generations. Some families spend weeks preparing food for the winter ahead. Drying fish, smoking meat, filling freezers before the coldest months arrive. In some areas, hunting remains an important part of life as well. Moose, caribou, and other game provide food that helps carry households through long winters. These traditions are not simply about survival. They are also about knowledge. Skills passed between generations. Lessons about seasons, rivers, weather, and the landscape itself. For many people, those traditions create a relationship with the interior that is difficult to find elsewhere. A connection built not only through where they live, but through how they live. In a world where cities continue to expand, where schedules grow busier, and where silence becomes increasingly rare, the interior offers something different. Space, not just physical space, but mental space, the feeling that there is still room to breathe, still room to think, still room to hear the wind moving through the trees, or the river flowing beyond the edge of town. For some people, that feeling becomes difficult to leave behind. The distances that once seemed intimidating become familiar. The winters that once felt overwhelming become part of the rhythm of life, and the silence that many people try to escape becomes something worth protecting. Perhaps that is why so many people remain here. Not because Alaska's interior is an easy place to live, but because it offers something increasingly difficult to find elsewhere: a sense of belonging, not only to a community, but to a landscape, a place where the relationship between people and the natural world still feels visible, and where life continues to move at a pace set not entirely by technology or growth or ambition, but by the land itself. Far from the glow of America's largest cities, the night sky feels almost untouched. And on certain winter nights, something extraordinary appears above the interior. Curtains of green light drift silently across the darkness, moving across frozen rivers, snow-covered forests, and distant horizons. For a few moments, the sky itself seems alive. The phenomenon is known as the aurora borealis, the northern lights, one of the most remarkable natural displays on Earth. People travel thousands of miles to witness it, to stand beneath it, and to watch the darkness suddenly fill with light. Yet for many who live in Alaska's interior, The aurora is not the reason they stay. It is simply part of the landscape, part of the sky, part of life. And perhaps that is what makes the interior so different. Because the true story of this place has never been about a single spectacle. Not the aurora. Not the winter. Not even the vast wilderness that surrounds it. The true story is the space between those things. The distance. The silence. The feeling of existing far from the noise of the modern world. In much of today's world, empty space is becoming increasingly rare. Cities continue to expand. Roads continue to reach farther. And places that once felt remote become a little less distant each year. But Alaska's interior is different. Not untouched. Not frozen in time. But different. The forests still stretch beyond the horizon. The rivers still connect communities across immense distances. And there are still places where silence feels as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves. For some people, that silence feels uncomfortable. For others, it is exactly what they are searching for. A reminder that the world can still be larger than the human presence within it. And perhaps that is why the interior continues to matter. Not because it is easy. Not because it is famous. And not because it belongs to another era, but because it preserves something that much of the modern world has slowly lost. Distance. Stillness. And room to breathe. In a nation defined by movement, the interior remains remarkably quiet. And in that quiet, it tells a story that few places still can. A story of wilderness. Of resilience, of people who chose to stay. And perhaps that is why the interior still matters today. Not because it stands apart from the modern world, but because it reminds us that some parts of the world were never meant to move at the same speed as the rest. beyond the highways, beyond the cities, beyond the endless noise of modern life, there is still a place where distance endures, where winter still shapes the rhythm of life. And in that quiet distance, the world's most silent winter remains.